Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. Change doesn't come easy. Whether it's changing the way we work or how we do things, it's hard, which is something organizations and institutions the world over have realized for a very long time, of course. For one, there might be internal resistance to change. There could also be bureaucratic obstacles. Then there is a lack of acceptance sometimes from senior and executive teams, and many more reasons why introducing change can, and ever so often does, fail. Since the middle of the 20th century, social scientists, management consultants, and psychologists try to come up with systematic approaches that can help introduce, implement, and manage change in organizations. Take, for instance, Cohen, who introduced a 3-step model of change, which consists of preparing for change, which he called unfreeze, introducing the change, and finally working to adopt and solidify the change in the organization, called refreeze. Or try the 8-step model of change from John Kotter, which he introduced in his book from 1996 called Leading Change. Whatever the model, a common and key ingredient to implement change and implement it successfully is to involve the very people who will be affected by it, be that the employees of a corporation, the volunteers of a charity, or members of an association, or indeed a mix of all of the above. One way of involving them is to find people who go into individual teams, departments, or faculties and advocate and support the change locally. And what better way to do this than with people who already work in the teams and departments? And these helpers are often called champions. And creating groups of champions or champion schemes has become one of the standard practices for managing change in organizations. I experienced this firsthand during my time in the private sector some 15 years ago. At the time, a group of us, including senior managers, wanted to introduce agile software development and management practices in the company. And we set up a group of champions to help us with that in teams and departments. To various degrees of success, I might add, but I come back to that later. For this episode, I want to focus on champions for change in research, and in particular how these champions try to help researchers adopt some common software development practices, or how researchers can effectively manage their research data. A number of universities and research centers have already implemented or tried champion schemes for better software and better research data management. And in one of the previous episodes, I already introduced you to a group of research software champions at the Imperial College London in the UK. And in the next few minutes, you'll hear from the two organizers of the scheme, Jeremy Cohen and Mike Bearpark, who will talk about what motivated them to introduce such a scheme at Imperial. I also had the pleasure of meeting with Sacha, Clair Castle and Lutfi Othman from Cambridge University, who are running a champion scheme focused on research data rather than research software. How are the two schemes run? What are the differences between them? And what lessons could we learn from them? In the next few minutes, we hear from the champion organizers directly, which I hope will answer at least some of these questions. So let's get started with Imperial College and Professor Mike Bearpark, who will give us a brief overview of the champion scheme.
I'm Michael Bearpark. I'm Professor of Computational Chemistry at Imperial College London. I'm also Academic Director of Research Computing. And as part of research computing, I'm one of the investigators on the Step Up project for research technical professionals that's currently running at Imperial, UCL, King's and Westminster in London.
Maybe that's also part of the whole research software championship that's running at Imperial.
It's linked with that because there have been a number of developments linked with research computing that have been supported by Research England through the Research England Culture Fund. One of which was a data repository. That was the first time we had access to that funding. That was a prototype that we developed. And the second time was a project to try and do more about Imperial software legacy. And part of that project was to develop a software catalogue, but the other part was to have champions who would go out into departments and evangelise, enthuse about software and see where they got to, see what the response was from the different departments. So it's very much a grassroots movement where we were seeding PhD students to go out and do what was appropriate for their department or what they judged to be appropriate without us telling them what was appropriate. I think that was very important.
All right, so you provided the means and they provided the action.
Some guidance, and a framework for doing it and perhaps some purpose for doing it as well.
So there were 2 cohorts. We have one running which is just about to end, I think the end of July 2024 at the time of recording. But there was also one last year that I think you were also part of. Could you tell us a little bit about how it started and how the first cohort ran and how it all went?
I can give a perspective, though, because one of my PhD students, Don Danilov, was part of that cohort. He was interested in modern software development practice. I think he was a little bit frustrated because what he found was that in our group, as it was at the time, we were working with a legacy code, still creating new developments for it, but the scope for doing some of what he wanted to do was perhaps a little bit limited. So he saw this as an opportunity both to gain experience and find out what others were doing, but I think he also saw it as a way of showing that he'd done something in that space. And it worked out because he was able to put this on his CV when he applied for a postdoc position and document that he'd done something. He'd been involved in training and helping others in this space. And that proved to be very useful. So perhaps one insight that I feel that I've got from having been involved in running 2 cohorts is it would be easy to focus on what the champions are doing for their departments, where they go, and easy to lose sight of what the benefits might be for them. And in fact, there are a number of key benefits, I think, including the opportunity to network, to develop some skills, to find out what others are doing, and to be able to document that. Those are the things that have come through from the champions that we've talked to, that there really are benefits for them.
And I'm coming back to the point Mike made about the benefits to champions a little bit later. But let's move on to Jeremy Cohen, who's also been organising the champion scheme at Imperial College in London. Jeremy is taking us through how the championship scheme works there.
I'm Jeremy Cohen. I'm a research fellow in the Department of Computing and Director of Research Software Engineering Strategy at Imperial College London.
How does the scheme work?
So the Research Software Champions scheme that we're running this year in 2024, we have a group of PhD students from departments across Imperial College London, and the students have a set of hours allocated to them. They're paid hourly for the work that they do as research.
Okay, so they're paid.
So they are indeed paid hourly for the work that they do, and we give them a kind of a block of hours, a budget effectively to work to, so they know how much time they can spend on the activity. And then within that time, we give the students some general guidance, but the idea is that they work with their peers in their department to understand what the challenges are locally in their departments around how people use software or want to use software and where they struggle with things, and then use the kind of information that they gather from talking to their peers to design routes to try and help solve some of the challenges that they face. So the approaches that we've seen are people running things like small workshops, running small get-togethers, be it kind of clinic sessions or coffee morning sessions where people can come and talk to their peers about how they work with software, the challenges they face, and so on. We've had opportunities to get people from our central research software engineering team to come and support the running of training courses or to talk to groups of researchers about key research software practices. So a range of different activities. And in terms of how we gather our group of champions in the first place, we put out adverts across the institution. We've tried to ensure that we get as wide a coverage as possible across the institution of people who are keen to engage with the scheme. And in doing that, we've been very successful in getting quite a large number of applications. We try then to ensure, as I say, that we have this sort of coverage as widely as possible across the institution, across the departments when we go about setting up the scheme.
How many champions in total applied for it and how many have we got?
In the current scheme, we had a large number of applications. We were able to accept 15 champions. So we have 15 champions who are representing 13 different departments across Imperial.
Oh, right. It's almost one per department.
So it's pretty much one per department. We have a couple of departments where we have specifically got 2 champions because they're either representing very different areas of research or they're representing different areas of experience in the research software space. But we were very heavily oversubscribed this time, and I think that shows that there is a lot of interest in this. And so I think that's very promising for future cohorts that suggests that there will be a lot of opportunities to find people who are keen to engage with this activity and to support their peers in doing this kind of work.
And if you want to hear from some of the champions at Imperial College, let me point you to an episode I did on the subject earlier this season, where you will hear a more in-depth view of how it all went for the champions themselves. So to summarize a few points, the scheme at Imperial College London is relatively new, with the first cohort being introduced last year, that is 2023. There are about 15 champions spread over 13 departments in the cohort of 2024, which is a pretty good coverage. And moreover, the effort champions are putting into this is being rewarded, which includes getting reimbursed financially. So far, so good. So let's leave Imperial College for a moment and turn a bit northeast of London and go to Cambridge, which is where Sacha and her colleagues Claire and Lutfi work. The champion scheme at Cambridge has been running for a longer period than at Imperial. In fact, the first cohort was set up in 2016, and Clair Castle was one of the first research data champions there. So let's turn to Claire now.
I'm Clair Castle. I'm the Research Data Manager at the University of Cambridge, and that means that I run the team that deals with the research data deposits onto our institutional repository, Apollo, but we do lots of other things like training, advocacy, policy development. I do more strategic things as well.
Right. University of Cambridge, that actually comprises a lot of colleges, doesn't it?
Yes, 30-something colleges.
Oh my God, yeah. And you're responsible for all of them?
Well, research data is probably just university research students and staff, although Cambridge is complicated because when you join the university, you join a college, really. But the research and teaching takes place at various different times, at points throughout your sort of research and studentship. So, yeah, we're kind of probably dealing with more department side of things rather than college. It's complicated in Cambridge.
Well, I think this is not the subject for our conversation. It's probably a separate podcast at some stage. But what I want to talk to you about is because I think you've been one of the first, if not the first, but certainly one of the first cohorts of data champions at the University of Cambridge. I think it was 2016?
16, yeah.
Yeah. What can you tell us about that? What got you into that in the first place?
Well, I was working at the time as the librarian at the Department of Chemistry, and there's a lot of data being collected in that department. So in my role, I was supporting researchers. When the Office of Scholarly Communication was established, which is where I'm working now, they were setting it up, and Marta Teperek, she was a research data coordinator. She was doing outreach into departments to see what we were doing in terms of research data management. And we ended up collaborating together on getting RDM teaching in place in my department as a sort of pilot for their training that they wanted to do. And this wasn't really to do with the data champions at that point, but then when it was later set up, I volunteered to be one of them, and that I was in the first cohort.
Could you tell us something about why the scheme was set up in the first place and what it is that you did as a champion at the time?
Well, the data champions, it was really something that Rosie Higman and Marta Teperek kind of established as a way of having a community of practice of people, made up of people from across the university in all different kinds of jobs who are working with research data could work together on things, network, find out more from each other, develop their own skills and share that with other people. And I had an interest because I was supporting researchers in my job. So I thought, well, it'd be useful to know more about this. Well, what I'm doing now is managing the service centrally for research data management. It's a connection back into the disciplines so that we can, plug in to them and we can help them, support them in what they're doing with data in their own departments, because we can't be abreast as a central service of absolutely everything in a department, all the types of research data that they use and create. So it's a good way of keeping in touch with that
What was it actually? What's the difficulty that researchers face when they deal with research data, digital research data? And where does the championship help in that?
Well, the difficulties are, I suppose, there's a lot of duplication of effort, I think, across the university. People are doing similar things with their data, but they may not be talking to each other. So they could be doing things in a different way, or a quicker way, or a more efficient way, but that information wasn't really being shared. So it's a good way of noting good best practice. And you can probably feel a bit isolated, maybe, in your department, and it might be nice to be part of a more of a community that can discuss things and have an input into central initiatives, I suppose, that are being organised. Yeah, I think it's feeling part of a community is what attracts people, and the fact that we can talk about all sorts of things. And I think people are inherently interested in data. They just find it really fascinating. There's always something new to learn that you hadn't known before.
So is it the question of sharing data? Is that the difficult bit, that you have data collected in one department for one research project, but it could be useful for another, but we don't know how to share it?
Not the research data itself, it's more like the skills around it and the knowledge around how to manage it. We try and teach people and train people how to think of data at every stage of their research project, their research life cycle. And it is relevant in most of it. So people will want to know which tools are the best to use to analyse their data. What are the storage options for their data, active research data when they're working on it, and also when they've finished with that project, what happens to it then? How do they share their data publicly? Because funders have data policies now where they require you to deposit your data as well as the paper it supports. So it's lots of issues around that and how best to do that, which can be tricky.
So there are a number of points Claire mentioned that sets the champion scheme at Cambridge apart from the one at Imperial College. The obvious difference is that the program at Cambridge focuses on research data, not so much on the software, as I mentioned earlier. But also, Cambridge University is complicated, which means that organizing a champion scheme across the university is trickier. I also like to draw attention to another point Claire made. Funders increasingly have certain policies around research data and to have them published along with a research paper. And this is indeed in line with what we are seeing in software too, where funders and research agencies require researchers to make their research software open and public. And with funders pushing for more open software and open research data, researchers need to get ready for making sure they deliver. But how to do so is something they often struggle with, which takes us back to our champions. As we heard, Cambridge University is a complex organization. To get a championship program started and keep it going, you need people who manage that. But you also need to get a large enough number of champions to go into all of the departments. And this is something I remarked on in my conversation with Sacha Jones. Sacha is head of scholarly office communications at Cambridge University Libraries, the office Claire, who we just heard from, works in. Sacha confirms that there is a large number of research data champions. She also explains why, and it's not only because of the size of the university. I think we're talking about quite a sizable number of champions now, aren't we? So how many have you got at the moment?
The latest I heard, and people come and go, I think it was around 180, thereabouts. The reason why the size of the community fluctuates is because probably around 3/4 or a little bit less than that are PhD students and postdocs. And we found they join the community at sort of different stages of their careers. So it could be at the beginning of their PhD, but it could be towards the very end as well.
And then once they finish their PhD, then they leave or they get different positions somewhere else.
Yeah. And the data champions are really for people who are currently at the University of Cambridge because they're acting as a champion for their department or their faculty or their research centre, whatever it might be, as that local source of support and also advocacy around good research data management and sharing of research data as well. But it depends on the department, it depends on the discipline. So that's the really special thing about this community, I think, is because we have data champions from a really wide range of disciplines across all of Cambridge's schools. So we've got 6 schools, so arts and humanities, humanities and social sciences, technology, physical sciences, biological sciences, and clinical medicine. And we have data champions across all of those schools and in many of the university's departments. We don't quite yet have a data champion every single department. That is the goal. And we also have a number of departments that have several data champions as well, which is interesting. And those can act as a cohort together, sort of championing for their department. That's quite exciting in terms of more heads together looking at these particular problems, but perhaps coming from it from different perspectives.
I understand that the champions are volunteers, so they're not getting paid for their effort. So how do you actually get them on board, and what do you expect them to do? Can you actually expect anything from them since they are volunteers? And how do you kind of handle
it's
that?
a really good question. Yeah, we don't really have any formal reward or recognition sort of structure behind the community, which I think is a bit of a problem, because what we'd really like is for there to be some formal recognition for data champions in their roles. We're looking into this at Cambridge at the moment, particularly around how we can reward and recognise open research practices. So data management and things that surround data management, open data, etc., but good research practices as well come into that. So I would like us to have more of a focus on this. Sometimes extracurricular activities, but sometimes it's central to some people's roles, that these activities do get recognised. Yeah, they are all volunteers. And so in terms of our expectations of the data champions, those expectations are minimal, and they should be minimal because this is a voluntary work. We do outline kind of what some of those minimal expectations are, but really there's a lot of flex in the system as well. And this is part of community management and having currently our 2 community managers to respond to what the data champions want as well and to support them in that. That's why it is critical to have those roles acting as community managers. Otherwise, I think it would just be something that would fizzle out.
Ah, yes. Another important fact about the championship at Cambridge is that all of the champions are volunteers. Another difference between Cambridge University and Imperial College London. Having a large group of volunteers, with a number of them leaving and joining more or less constantly, brings a number of challenges. And if you're not careful, such a program may, as Sacha put it, fizzle out. To avoid that from happening, you'll need to put in extra effort. And we just heard Sacha talking about community managers at Cambridge whose job it is to look after the volunteers. Here she emphasises the need for them again.
You need somebody to manage a community like this for it to continue. It would be hard to sustain a community if you didn't have somebody dedicated towards looking after it. So we're very lucky now that we have a research data team of 3 people, and 2 people within that team kind of work together on managing the community.
We already heard from Claire, who is on Sacha's team. Next, I want to turn to Lutfi Ben Othman.
So my name is Lutfi Othman. I'm a research data coordinator with the Office of Scholarly Communication here in Cambridge with the University Library. And I'm also a co-lead of the Data Champions program, along with my colleague, Kim Cluxton.
All right. Okay. And that's exactly what I want to talk about, because there are quite a number of volunteers at Cambridge, and you're looking after them. Is that right?
That is correct, yes. Although looking after them, it's more of a loose management style because it is a volunteer program. And we are very conscious of not wanting for them to spend too much time away from their direct projects. So it's always a bit of a delicate balancing act because we want them to be involved and to feel part of the community and feel connected to it. But at the same time, we don't want to put too much pressure on them to contribute. So it's quite a loose organization.
Well, as we said, Cambridge has a large number of data champions spread over schools and departments, so I ask Lutfi next to tell us a bit more about the champions themselves and how he and his colleagues keep the group of volunteers together and engaged, and what he meant by loose management. Here's Lutfi again.
we see the champions as basically the research specialists for the particular group or discipline or community on the ground. And we are part of the central infrastructure. And Cambridge being how it is, very fragmented, very wide, it's impossible for us to know every research initiative that's going on. So this is when we rely on the champions to let us know what's happening on the ground in the particular space. So for us, it's very important, even if it's loosely organized, as we have mentioned. So far, whenever we have come to them for help of a particular query or a particular data type, they've always responded. In regards to how we set the tone for this sort of loose management, we are very clear from the onset at the data champions induction, and every time we meet a new data champion or someone's inquiring to become a data champion, we tell them very clearly, we understand that you're busy, we don't expect a lot, just try to come to the forum. We try to really emphasize that the forum, at least from my perspective, the forum is, I view it as the beating heart of the community, because Cambridge is so fragmented, everyone's all over the city. The forum's the only time where everyone comes together in person, listen to an interesting discussion and have a lunch, because we offer lunch. But what we realize is, as long as you get them in a room, because I feel like data champions they tend to be quite a passionate bunch. They're really interested in data. They're really interested in helping others. As long as you get them in a room together, it won't take long before someone's got a query and then someone else is answering. And then when they go for lunch, they're having their own discussion and connections are made. So we tell them at the induction, please come to the forum. You will benefit. We benefit from you being a champion, and hopefully you will benefit from the community as well. And there's other things that we do, like we have this program called the school rep program. So we appoint a data champion to be sort of someone closer in contact with us in a particular school, and they organize termly meetings to find out what's going on. And then this school rep will meet us once a term as well.
The championships at Imperial College London and Cambridge University are quite different. At Imperial, the focus is on research software, and at Cambridge on research data. Cambridge has been running for 8 years, and Imperial started its program in 2023 with the first cohort. At Cambridge, there's a large group of champions, some 180 of them, at Imperial 15. And champions at Cambridge are volunteers, whereas at Imperial there's some financial incentive for the work they do as well. But whatever the difference, there are a couple of things they have in common. One is the need for strong incentives to join the program. Of course, helping others can be rewarding itself, and is indeed a strong incentive. But another one is to be able to learn something yourself, and to be able to grow your network across campus, which is what Mike Bearpark from Imperial mentioned earlier. And Clair Castle from Cambridge told us that working with others helps each of them face common problems. And having a community of champions as a go-to place makes this a lot easier. There's also the realization that champion programs cannot run on autopilot, which means there needs to be someone looking after them. In particular at Cambridge, where there's a large number of volunteers, and we heard from 2 community managers who work hard to keep it all together. At Imperial, champions also get financial support for their effort. And finally, you also need to keep going. Change doesn't happen overnight. Sadly, there's no magic wand that makes researchers write better software or handle their data in a more reusable and interoperable way. Continuity is one of the big challenges in change management. Programs based on volunteers seem to have the advantage that they at least need not look for funding all the time. However, as we've seen with Cambridge, that's not quite the case, as there are full-time managers to keep the program together. As for Imperial College, I wanted to find out from Jeremy Cohen how he thinks the program and funding will continue.
So what happens once the pilot scheme ends? So what happened last year, for instance? Because if it runs for half a year, what's happening in the other half of the year?
I mean, that's a really good question. And the answer is that in terms of the champion scheme itself, we haven't been able to do anything else due to the lack of funding during the other parts of the year. But we do have, obviously, then a cohort of people who we have worked with over the period of time when they have been funded and able to do stuff. And we have been able to reach out to that cohort in terms of being able to advertise opportunities to them and to give them the opportunity to advertise things that are going on to their communities locally. So it's been a very positive experience of trying to make connections with the wider research community. But of course, it would be great if we had more opportunity to fund activities over a longer period. And as I say, I think that's something we will be able to do in the future. But it definitely shows that there are things we can do, and we can see very clearly now from the two kind of pilots that we've run where there's great opportunities and where there are things that we can build on, and we will look to do that hopefully over a longer period in the future.
Finally, let's hear from Sacha Jones from Cambridge University. The scheme has been running for a while, and I wanted to know from her what's on her priority list.
So, what's on the priority list? Okay, so 2 areas immediately come to mind. I'd say one area in our priority list is really looking at particular disciplinary areas where we don't have much coverage. And that is certainly in the arts and humanities departments at the university. So we do have some data champions, but I'd say for the past couple of years, those have been some of the areas where we've been targeting. My team's done some really interesting work in social anthropology, which actually isn't in the School of Arts and Humanities, but it's one of the areas where having conversations about open data, as you can imagine, are quite tricky, especially when it comes to issues of ethics and consent and so on. But we've been having some really interesting conversations with people in that department. The arts and humanities in general, I would say, is one of the priorities. I think a second priority looking to the future as well is to really up our game when it comes to reproducible research and what that might mean also in different practices, different disciplines. That is another area I think is a future priority. And then a third one that I could think of that I think is a bit of a gap, and I think this is from having conversations with you and also Jeremy in Imperial to create a tie into your other podcasts, is a focus on actually the research software engineer community, which there isn't an equivalent, at least as far as I'm aware, at Cambridge. That is an area that would be interesting to pursue and to sort of tie together with the data champion network that we have.
In research, we want to help researchers write better software and produce and manage fair research data, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that's no small undertaking given the fact that researchers may be experts in their domains, but relative novices when it comes to research software and data. Champion programs can be an effective way to help with that. But alas, there is no guarantee they'll succeed. And anecdotally, I heard from other champion schemes that went nowhere. So starting a championship isn't enough. And often it feels like this is actually the easy part. Keeping the program going is the challenge. Because change, if it happens, will come slowly. So if you're thinking about having a champions program or joining an existing one, I hope the stories from Imperial College London and Cambridge University gives you some ideas. Before we end, I would like to thank Imperial College London again for their support and all my interview partners for their time and patience. And if you would like to support the show, get in touch, which you can do directly from your podcast app or via email or through LinkedIn, Mastodon, Slack or Matrix. You can also leave a little something via my Patreon page. Thanks for listening. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.